Shalom. I want to give all praises and honor and glory to the only true God of heaven and earth, whose name is Yahweh, and to his only begotten Son, the Messiah, whose name is Yahweh Shai. And double honors to my elders and teachers in Great Millstone, and honors to all the prophets and teachers that carry the spirit of the spirit of faith, and the spirit of truth within them. My name is Zachariah. Hear my speech concerning the truth, that is the word of the living God. The title of this lesson will be Satan wants you attached to the temporal. Now, the sensual, the mortal, the earthly, the temporary, the carnal, these things ultimately define the temporal ultimately. Now, I want to start this lesson off in the book of Luke, chapter 22, verse 31. And the Lord said, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan hath desired to have you, that he may sift you as wheat. So Satan desired to have Peter, to overthrow his faith, and ultimately to separate him from God, from the truth, from the Spirit. So it is with you believers, those of you who subscribe to this word. Satan will have his different occasions, to attack you. Different seasons and times of your faith, to try to sift you. Now, when you go into that word sift, it's a metaphor for an inward agitation in an attempt to overthrow one's faith. Now, Satan would induce certain situations in your life and in your heart, certain emotions and thoughts in your heart, to keep you stuck on that which is earthly, mortal, sensual, and carnal, that you may be mentally separated from the spiritual, where there's ultimately profit, and good and salvation in the spiritual things. So you will take away your mind from the spiritual things and try to fix it on the moral things, on the sensual things. Whether it be by way of envy, or lust, or grudge, or desire, or covetousness. Or pride, which these things are ultimately vain. Consider, those who may envy you, whether it be a neighbor, a friend, or even your own woman, your own girl, may secretly hate you, and you may know that. And that could be Satan's way to induce hatred in you, to keep you locked in on a low level. Or he may use things to induce fear in you. Bills, threats, from someone who can't control their anger. Or someone who may move in a way that is to provoke annoyance in you. These things are all, emotions and thoughts and mental states that are low on a low level. And these things can ultimately keep you occupied away from that which is important, from that which is needful, that is these spiritual things. So this is how Satan would keep you attached to the temporal. Now, from there, I want to go to the book of Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 9, to, make my point. This is Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 9, verse 14. For the thoughts of mortal men are miserable, and our devices are but uncertain. So we're limited naturally. So like, bear with me while I all right, so Archon. So let me continue. It says, for the thoughts of mortal men are miserable, and our devices are but uncertain. So naturally, on a mental level, we are limited in our thinking. We think small. When you go into that word miserable, it means inadequate or small. So we're mentally limited. And that's ultimately the level that Satan would ultimately, bring you upon. So like, bear with me. Go, man. Slocky had to get my cat out the room. That's the level Satan will ultimately play you on that miserable level. So when it comes to being in this truth, you're operating on a level that is outside of that miserable level, that inadequate and small level. You think about prophecy. You think about the judgments of God. His wrath, his coming wrath upon the kingdoms, and his salvation towards the children of Israel. You think about the coming of our Lord Yahweh Shai. These things that ultimately is beyond that miserable and low level, that small level. But Satan will try to bring you back on that miserable level. Before the truth, our thoughts were miserable. Our thoughts were limited and small. We were thinking about fashion, cars, and girls, or females were thinking about shopping and keeping up with the Joneses. Thinking about college and marriage and these things that are ultimately going to pass away. So that's that limited, that's that miserable, small, inadequate level, basically. And that's what Satan will try to play you on. That level Satan will try to play you on, or attack you on, or to bring you upon, to bring you back to that level. In other words, it says, and our devices are but uncertain. It says, for the corruptible body presseth down the soul, and the earthly tabernacle weigheth down the mind, that museth upon many things. And that's another thing Satan will try to do. Since he operate on that temporal level. Well, not, or he have, or shall I say, he have influence on that temporal level, because he himself is not temporal. Satan is a spirit. He also got, consider the other evil spirits and demons and devils that's under him, because Satan is also known as a prince in the Bible. Now, a prince, you go into it, means a captain or a chief, or, someone who's over, So Satan, in a way, he's over other demons and devils and stuff like that. So when I say Satan, I'm not just talking about Satan himself. I'm talking about other demons as well that's under Satan. But anyways, Satan will also try to fix your mind upon, you know, the profoundness of nothing, you know, whether it be, the mind of other people towards you, the opinions of other people, you know. That's a profoundness of nothing, you know. Your mind can think upon so many things and so deeply, full of vanity, man. Who cares? Who cares? Or your mind could, he could try to get your mind upon, just thinking about different things upon, for example, in this, modern age, the term, that's popularized, the term maladaptive daydreaming, for example, which is something that, many people, do, which is, in, other words, fantasizing and daydreaming, just thinking about things that is non-existent. And believe it or not, people are stuck in a loop, I mean, of thinking about their fantasies, where they're so concerned with things that are non-existent, that are nothing, and so stuck and deep in these things that they are, ultimately distracted from the spiritual, the needful, so this is something that Satan is also able to do as well. you know, you know, try to induce within you as well, So from there I want to go to the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 14. First Corinthians chapter 2, verse 14. It says, "But the natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God." So when you're natural, when you're on a natural level, mentally, you are not able to receive the things that are spiritual, such as this word, which is of the Spirit of God. The knowledge of judgment, which is of the Spirit of God. The knowledge of prophecy, which is of the Spirit of God. The testimony of Yahweh Shai, which is of the Spirit of God. You're not able to operate on that spiritual level by being natural. Now, when you go into that word natural, it means the sensuous nature with its subjective or subjection to appetite and passion. So, for example, being emotional, being angry, that could literally distract you from the spiritual, from things that lead up to everlasting life. It's like a weight that holds you down from progress in the spiritual, from the spiritual activity, and we all should be active. Or, for example, what's continually upon the minds of people of this world, what they want or what they don't have, what they desire to have and what they don't have. And this is what their mind is full of. But we ought not to be like that. We ought not to be in that thinking, just your mind is continually fixed on your haves and your have-nots, what you have and what you don't have. So that's an example of being natural, being in a temporal state of thinking. And this is some Satan will try to induce in you, you know. You know, for example, maybe you live in an area that's dangerous, and maybe something was stolen from your yard or your backyard. You know, maybe your kid's bike or something, and that can induce within you a desire to live in a better neighborhood. So it could that could take your mind from that which is spiritual. Now you think about living in a better neighborhood. That's all your mind on. How to get to a better neighborhood, how to live in a better neighborhood. But here it is, the Lord's about to execute his judgment upon earth. And you're going to be all distracted while prophecy is about to happen. You know, and the Lord's about to come. You know, this is, how Satan operates. You know, or even by way of social media. You know, on a daily basis, social media is full of, the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the pride of life. You know, you go on social media, you see what you don't have. So Satan will try to induce, these thoughts within you. Discontentment, anger, ingratitude, for example, these different things. So Satan will try to keep you fixed on a temporal instead of the spiritual. You know? So being natural mentally, in your reasoning, you're not going to be able to receive the things that are spiritual. And this is why the world cannot receive the spirit of truth. This is not why the world cannot receive sound doctrine. Because they're natural. They're operating on a sensual, earthly, mortal, and weak level. A mind full of what they don't have. Thoughts full of what they don't have. Which that provoke different emotions. And what they desire to have. Or being so concerned with what angers them. You know? And that's why when you look at the conversation of those in the world, for example, there's, some people who, whose lips, whose mouths are full of gossip, continually talking about a situation that probably happened yesterday or last week, even last month, about something that somebody did to them or argument that they had last month. This is literally a loop. They're in a loop. They're trapped in a loop of negativity, of shit that don't truly matter, of shit that perisheth, or that ultimately, is temporary, And even wine or strong drink, these things can induce a temporal state of thinking. You start drinking, and now those emotions start coming up. Bitter emotions concerning, something that happened to you. or your problems with somebody else. Hey, that's why we have to watch how we wake up. We have to take heed how we start our day, because there's some cases, which we all know ourselves, and I know myself. You'll wake up angry about a certain circumstance, or certain problem that you have or faced, recently or in the past. This is why it is written, don't let the sun go down on your anger. Anger, that's something that's common. That's just something that's going to happen to us. That's reality. Sometimes that's just going to come, and we can't really escape that fully. But don't let the sun go down on your anger, because if the sun go down on your anger, you're attached to something. You're attached to the temporal. You're attached to those emotions. You're attached to the thing that made you angry, that provoked those emotions or those thoughts. You're attached to the temporary, to the earthly, to the mortal, to the vain. And that can weigh you down from being mentally active upon the spiritual. It says, for they are foolishness unto him, neither can they know them, because they are spiritually discerned. Now, on the context level, this is referring to those who can't receive the gospel, can't receive the knowledge of the truth, because they're just stuck on the natural. But even in this spiritual, even if you are spiritual, that natural man, that old man is what it's called. When you're reborn again, that old way of life and that old way of thinking is called the old man in the Bible. Sometimes that old man try to come back. The old way of thinking can come back or try to come back. So this is where you have a struggle, and that's what the word wrestle means. That spiritual warfare is a wrestle against spiritual forces of evil, ultimately. And that word wrestle means to struggle. So there is a struggle. I want to go to the book of Matthew, chapter 6, verse 22. Now, as I was trying to explain, I don't know if I explained it right or efficiently, but basically, when we look at the movies about spiritual warfare, and a righteous man's struggle with darkness, sometimes it's dramatic. Sometimes, Hollywood show actual demons messing with the righteous and spiritual man, or demons speaking through, another person, or, dramatic scenes of spiritual warfare. And I'm not saying it don't get dramatic, because it's a very real thing, but sometimes spiritual opposition, for example, let me put it like that, spiritual opposition can come in a way that is normal or common or the usual. The same old chaos, for example. The same old, bitter neighbor or something. The same old, spiritual opposition don't look like a demon looking at you or appearing in front of you in the mirror. It don't look like that. Or a shadow following you. And I'm not saying that these things can happen, but spiritual opposition don't look like that. Not all the time, shall I say. And again, I can't say that it can't look like that, but it don't look like that. Not all the time. Maybe for some believers, maybe that happens, and stuff like that, but it don't, it just, just being realistic, it don't look like that. Again, I don't want to say it never looked like that, And I'm not a good speaker, so forgive me, Lord willing, you understand what I'm trying to say. But anyways, Matthew 6, verse 22. These are the words of Yahweh Shai. The light of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. Now the light of the body is referring to the mind, and the mind is referred to as an eye. So when it says if thine eye be single, in other words, you're focused. You're spiritually vigilant and focused on the spiritual things, on the truth. You're operating mentally on a spiritual level. It says thy whole body shall be full of light. And basically, to break down this metaphor or analogy, consider the candle, for example. A candle is the source that gives light to the whole space of a room, for example. The candle, spreads light throughout the room. So when it comes to the mind, if the state of your mind, your thoughts, for example, is good and spiritual, then that's ultimately going to lead or spread throughout your life and your behavior and your decision makings. Because ultimately your mind and your thoughts is the source of your actions. It's the source of your behavior and your words. So those who are on a spiritual level mentally, they're mentally are focused on the spiritual things. They're one-minded on the spiritual things. Then their life, are going to be, towards the spiritual things, spiritual deeds, good works. You're sowing spiritual things. You're living according to the spiritual. So Satan will try to, influence that source, that mind, your thoughts. And that's why in the book of Proverbs, they tell you, chapter 4, to guard your heart with all diligence, because out of it floweth the issues of life. So it's the source of your behavior. It's the source of your actions. It's the source of your direction in life. Verse 23 says, but if thine eye be evil, it's like, forgive me, I don't know why I just said that, or say it like that. Verse 23, it says, but if thine eye be evil, meaning what? Your thoughts are evil, your mind is evil, your focus is evil, or it's on evil things. Your concern is on evil things. Your desires is on evil things. If thine eye be evil, thy whole body shall be full of darkness. In other words, your life and your direction in life is going to go the same direction that your mind is going, which is evil. So the mind is the source of your life and your goings in life, your behaviors and your actions. and your decisions. So the state of your mind will influence, the state of your life, the state of your style of life. Your conversation. And this is why, in order to clean up your life, you got to first start with your mind and your thought process. It says, but if thine eye be evil, thy whole body shall be full of darkness. So that's where Satan will attack you. He will attack you, mentally, on a mental level. He won't attack you like how they, like in the Hollywood movies. Like you literally going to fight with the devil. No, that's not the case. He will try to influence you on a mental level in your thought process. It says, if therefore the light that is in thee be darkness, meaning, in other words, if your thoughts, your mind, and your focus and your intents, and you be evil, it says, how great is that darkness? So it starts with the mind. You gotta guard your mind, protect your mind from envy, from grudge, from anything that is vain and temporal. What people say, don't, let anyone have control of your emotions. That's true. Don't let anything dictate your thoughts and your emotions outside of the spiritual. It's your mind is a whole nother realm that you gotta guard. Let's go to the book of Ephesians, chapter 4, verse 17. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 17, it says, this I say therefore, and testify in the Lord, that ye henceforth walk not as other Gentiles walk, in the vanity of their mind. And this is where Satan will want you to be in a vain, temporal state of thinking. And that's the mindset, that's the thought process. And that's what the mind of the heathens, of those outside of this truth. Not just the heathen. When they say Gentiles, it's referring to the Israelite Gentiles. So, the unbelievers, those outside of this truth, who may be Israelites, their mind is full of vanity and the temporal, the carnal and the sensual. They're stuck on a small, limited level of thinking. While we see an end, for example, of America and life outside of an end of America, they only see America with no boundary. The only boundary is their own life. They understand that they're mortals, but that's it. They think this is the end all be all. That's an example of being in a temporal state of thinking. And what could keep you in that mindset? College degree, a desire for a family and a good life in this world, or focusing to please your woman. These things are temporal. In fact, let's go into that word vanity real quick. Vanity meaning devoid of truth and appropriateness, perverseness, depravity, frailty, want of vigor, transientness. So being your mind is full of things that's going to pass away. You know. For example, beef. People having beef with their neighbor or their ops or whatever. Your ops are going to die. This world's going to, and there's people, for example, there's people out here whose mind is so negative, and they don't even know famine's about to come, that the Lord's about to bring famine upon them. War is about to come. This guy, I forgot his name on YouTube. It's a white Edomite dude, and he will interview, hoods, different hoods and different gangs and stuff in black culture. And he, posted a new video, and he was talking with this Houston guy, this Texas guy. And he was basically asking him, if the government wants you to fight a war, with Iran, what you gonna do? In a roundabout way, he asked him about that. And this guy, this Texas guy, who was part of the hood, the gang, whatever, he said, we fighting a war of our own. In other words, with other gangs and stuff like that, with other people. So here it is, a war that's so much important that could lead to a nuclear annihilation is about to come. And they so focused on something small, something that, something that's less than that war, just so focused on that which is before them, people fighting over hoods and blocks and streets and stuff like that, when you about to starve, literally, bro. So it's just bullshit. It's just, verse 18, it says, having the understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them, because of the blindness of their heart, who being past feeling have given themselves over unto lasciviousness, to work all uncleanness with greediness. But ye have not so learned in Yahushua Mashiach. So we learned the spiritual things. We learned the good way of thinking. We learned righteousness. We learned discretion. We learned temperance. We learned prudence. We learned virtue. We didn't learn these miserable things. We didn't learn to be carnal. We didn't learn sensuality and weakness in Yahushua. The knowledge and this truth is what separates you from that darkness ultimately. It says, if so be that ye have heard him and have been taught by him, as the truth is in Mashiach Yahushua, that ye put off concerning the former conversation, that is a way of life, your way of living. That's what conversation means. That ye put off concerning the former conversation, the old man, which is corrupt according to deceitfulness of lust, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind. So protect your mind, guard your mind. Don't let Satan have place in your mind by way of anger, wrath, covetousness, malice. Don't let Satan have place in your mind by way of these things. It says, and that ye put on the new man, which is after God, is created in righteousness and true holiness. So I'm going to close off on that. Lord willing, this lesson's edifying. I want to give all praise and honor and glory to Yahweh Bashem Yahushai. Shalom.